or my webcam's over there right at you. Okay. All right. So yeah. So here's my about me. And I guess at this point, I don't even have to read it out loud. I just like wrote an entire resume about myself in MediaWiki. And I don't know. I guess I think it's pretty boring. I've done a bunch of stuff. A couple of years while I was at EMWCon, I was talking with someone, and she was like, you're not like really. And I like really don't mean any offense to anyone with this, because it was like really, we were joking about this. We were like, it just really doesn't feel like we're anyone until we've written an extension. And so I feel like so pleased that I'm able to like finally write down that I am in fact the author of an extension. So I definitely wanted to put down custom logs, even though like in relation to everything else, that's probably the least important thing that I've done. But I had to include that line. So that'll be the rest of this slide, and I guess I'll turn my camera off now. So, you know what? I think I was supposed to click this.
That's right, you're good now.
Right, so not actually like close the thing, but actually click this. All right, cool. So my talk this year, this is the first time I'm ever giving a non-technical talk at EMWCon. So those of you who have attended multiple EMWCons with me are going to be like totally shocked by this development. This is not a technical talk. It's about a design philosophy that I hold very near and dear to my heart. I don't like info boxes. By the end of the talk, you'll see that this opinion is slightly less dogmatic than I'm saying at the start, but I want you to remember this talk. And so I'm saying it in as clickbaity a way as I could possibly come up with. So I don't like info boxes, and I'll see if I can actually fill the entire 30-minute period that I have allocated to me with why I don't like info boxes. So I decided to start with a very famous quote. I don't like info boxes. They're coarse and rough and irritating, and they get everywhere. And a lot of moviegoers slightly misheard this quote as it was originally written when they went and saw a very famous movie. But this is how Anakin Skywalker actually delivered the line when he was talking to Padme, and Padme found his insights into UI UX design so insightful that she immediately fell in love with him. So some questions to address in this presentation. What did Anakin really mean by this line? And did I write this talk just so I could make that slide? And we will be addressing these questions in reverse order. So question number 1, did I make this talk just so I could make that slide? And the answer is yes, I did. By the way, I didn't link these slides in the conference talk, but you're more than welcome to follow along if you want to. So let me go ahead and link that in the stage chat. And there's a bunch of speaker notes that are more like asides. And if you want to follow along with the speaker notes, feel free to. I'm not covering every single speaker note. So you're sort of missing out if you're not reading the speaker notes as you follow along. So what did Anakin really mean? And there's actually essays and essays and essays on the internet analyzing this line and what Anakin really meant when he was talking to Padme about not liking sand, and whether he was rebelling against the Jedi Order, who aren't supposed to have their own personal feelings or dislikes about something, and is this a metaphor for slavery? And I don't know. I linked one in the description, and I'd appreciate if you wait until after the talk is over to read it. But I mean, go wild trying to figure out what George Lucas was actually trying to say. But we'll slightly put a more, in my opinion, interesting twist on the topic and say reasons why I don't like info boxes. So there's a few categories here. The first one is relational logic issues, which, okay, I said it was a non-technical talk, but yes, we are going to talk about cargo. responsive web design problems. Yes, we're going to talk about CSS a little bit, although I won't show you any specific CSS selectors. So this is all very broad. It's more design issues that have to do with responsive web design. But I've spent a lot of time writing media queries in CSS, so this is borderline technical. Usability problems, and then information behavior problems. And the last one is something that you might not be familiar with. And I'm saying that because I was not familiar with this until fairly recently. And credit actually goes to my mom to introducing me to the field of information science, which is wildly interesting. And I read an entire book that was a literature review of this subject, and I highly recommend reading it to anyone who's like in the slightest bit interested in it. But first, let's talk about relational logic problems, because cargo is my favorite thing. So infoboxes only work for fields that are one-to-one with its topic. So what that means is that if you look at the info box that I have here as an example, check out the country of birth field. There's no ambiguity that country of birth is a field belonging to the player. There's no ambiguity that residency is a field that belongs directly to the player, or the role of bot laner belongs to the player. But what about the team history? Does the fact that the first team was Fnatic belong to the player? And if I were here in person, I would actually ask you to raise your hands, but feel free to answer in chat if you have opinions about that. Does the start and end dates of Sanchez's tenure on Fnatic belong to the player? Does the Twitter link belong to the player? These answers are not quite so clear, because in a sense, yes, those are Sanchez's NIST things, but in a well-normalized database, no, they do not belong to the player. What they belong to is team history, which belongs to the player. So when I said one-to-one, sort of the opposite of that, it's not really an opposite because there's multiple types of relations that you can have. Another version of that is one-to-many. There are many lines of team history for each player, and Fnatic belongs to one of the lines of team history, and his team history belongs to himself. So when we try to display information that's one-to-many with respect to the subject in question, we have this very, very cramped view. And this also ties into responsive design, because the problem is really here that we have this large amount of information and we're constrained to 270 pixels. And first of all, it's hard to fit that much stuff into this small place. We're forcing ourselves to use a font size that's below accessibility standards. And we also are just being a little bit confusing here, because it looks a lot like Fnatic belongs to Sanchez, which is not true. Fnatic belongs to that first row of team history, which in turn belongs to Sanchez's team history. Team history is very complex, so instead the one that I wrote out on this slide was social media. Imagine all of the information that we could put about the social media. Obviously, you can see how much extra development work this would take, because we would be needing to use an API to deal with all of it. But name of platform, link to the platform, number of followers, which would be updated via an API that runs, say, once every 24 hours, date that the profile was created, last post made there. We could potentially even embed the entirety of the last post link to the last post. So you have a link to the profile, you have a link to the last post. Perhaps we could even embed a scroll of the last 10 posts or something. But we can't even consider doing this in the space provided. Now you might question, well, is it really in scope for us to be embedding all of this information about the player's social media? But you want to be defining the scope. You don't want the UI to be forcing scope decisions on you. And because of info boxes, scope decisions get forced on you without even giving you the ability to make scope decisions. So you're really getting forced into a box, a literal box, with what you are and are not allowed to do with your platform, because users expect all of the information to be in the info box. And because users expect all of the information to be in the info box, you continue putting more stuff in the info box. And it's just this vicious cycle where you have this non-responsive, by non-responsive, I mean it's not responsive design section that contains everything. And then at the end, I have this little note. Well, the form is perfectly fine for names, for fields like names, because names are one-to-one with the subject. Or are they? Because with name, you want to show the transliteration into the Roman alphabet. And you also want to show the name of the alphabet from which you're transliterating it. Maybe that's not quite so one-to-one. So a continuation of the relational logics problem slide. So here's how and this is an actual real problem that I addressed, and I totally changed it and everything's so much better now. So if you look at the team history before, and then you compare it to now, well, now, like, we couldn't show, like, the duration of the tenure. And now we have, like, an entire column that shows the duration of the tenure, which is like an entire new data point that's displayed. We've also added the regions. So, like, it says Europe on the side. That was not displayed previously because we didn't have space for it. Everything's a much bigger font, so it's much more in keeping with accessibility rules. If you look before, we also didn't have a reference for each, like a citation for each piece of information. We're now citing everything. And then you'll also have these toggles of whether you want to switch the data around to combine rule swaps into fewer lines, and if you want to show exact dates or approximate dates. It's just a better thing to interact with. And so we spent years on this project. It was actually very difficult for me to find one that had not been converted so that I could screenshot it for this. But the space can breathe so much better now, and there's just so much more information here. And more importantly, it's clear that this information, no single piece of information in this table is subsidiary to the player. Sure, this information concerns the player, but this is the team history. Each line here is a line of team history, and it's not like Devils 1 belongs to the player. It's this line of tenure belongs to the player. Another problem is that it's not just a display problem, but it's also going to be very confusing for the people who are writing the code, because people writing code are going to assume that they write code that mirrors what the display looks like. And getting people to decouple their code from the display is a very challenging issue. In addition to running Leadpedia, I was also consulting on tons and tons of Gamepedia and fandom wikis that ran cargo. And the number of times that I saw something that was like past team 1, past team 2, past team join date 1, past team join date 2, past team leave date 1, past team leave date 2. Imagine doing relational logic when your database design looks like this. And the reason it looks like this, instead of having a tenures table, is that that's what they see. They want to make a table for what they see. And why should they not make a table for what they see? They haven't spent years reading or taking classes about proper relational database design. But if you're, on the other hand, physically building elements on the page, then your database design is naturally going to conform to the correct way to display the data. So it's definitely true that in neither situation should you necessarily have your database conform to the design of the pages, and you should always pick a schema that makes the most sense and then design things that make the most sense, and never do you have to couple the two. But if you are newer to database design and you feel most comfortable when you are coupling the two together, the better state of affairs is when your display is coupled to a sensible database design, because otherwise you're never going to be able to code anything. There was a similar example on Wikipedia, the English Wikipedia, that I didn't put in here, but zip codes and area codes in New York City are put in an info box. And this is another thing that is definitely a one-to-many thing, where there are many area codes, many zip codes in New York City. And this is something that I'm not an expert in. Like, I'm definitely an expert in League of Legends esports, so I can go on and on and on about like what kind of information needs to be there and what doesn't. But even where something where I'm not an expert, like, it just, to me, it doesn't make any sense for zip codes and area codes to be listed in the info box there, because there's so much additional information that one would want to know about a zip code and an area code, such as what is the bounding box in terms of latitude, longitude, coordinates for a zip code or area code? What's the population density? Historically, when were these things founded? And when you put it in an info box, all you get is a list. You get none of the other stuff. Now, are these points of data in scope for Wikipedia? Maybe not. But again, as I said before, with the social media stuff on Wikipedia, you're defining yourself out of scope by placing it into this small UI space, and maybe it would be in scope if you didn't limit yourself to an info box. So now we're going to talk about responsive layout problems version 1. So you've just constrained yourself to your entire width of the most important part of your page to being 270 pixels wide. Some info boxes are a little bit wider, some are a little bit narrower, but I measured the one on Wikipedia and it's 270 pixels wide. And they put pictures at the top. Oh, okay.
Yes.
So where's the rest of the information? That's all I have to say about this. My screen doesn't have space to say anything more interesting because it's all below the fold in the info box. Responsive layout problems version 2. On mobile, your info box is above the entire rest of your content. How far do you really want your users scrolling? On desktop, your info box is to the right of the rest of your content, at least in vector, and probably a bunch of other skins. For how long do you really want a contracted page width? Info boxes are not free space, guys. Don't waste your pixels with silly little fields like favorite ice cream flavor if you're making an info box about your office workers. And in this case, I can't really fit anything else onto the page, as you can see, because I have an info box. So now let's go into usability problems. This is a very widespread problem, I guess. Like, usability is one of like the biggest fields in design, and I'm not even going to begin to scratch the surface of it. I'm just going to put a couple observations that I've made over the years. So I'm going to start this slide with an anecdote that's not actually present on the slide, but the first person who actually listened to like V0 of this talk was my mom, and I was explaining to her how much I hate info boxes, and she was like, "What's an info box?" And to preface this, my mom is like a very savvy computer user. She knows how to use hotkeys to do things like Control C, Control V, and she definitely like understands file systems and how you can use Windows Explorer to manipulate your files, and then their locations will be changed when you open them in Word and stuff. And she's like the person who sets up her faculty's website for their course every year and stuff. And when her Bluetooth headset wasn't working, she like Googled the problem and troubleshooted it herself. And I like wasn't even helping. So she's like definitely a very competent computer user for her generation. But the thing is that her generation was trained to look at the middle of a page to find useful information. And so sidebars are very, very difficult. So, because she's just not used to looking for sidebars there. And so when I asked her, like, you know what an info box is, right? It's like that thing on the side of a Wikipedia page that contains like bullet points and facts and stuff. She had no idea what I was talking about. So I had to like point to her, that's an info box on a Wikipedia page. And she was like, I had literally never seen that before. So you can't actually, like, depending on your audience, you actually can't count on your users to notice an info box. So this is sample size 1 and totally anecdotal, but I am pretty certain that if you sample, especially like older computer users who didn't grow up with the idea of toolbars and the idea that the most important stuff is all around the edges, because that's such a huge generational paradigm shift that like the center of the screen is basically useless and everything useful is around the edges. People are just not going to notice the info box. And then for one that everyone can relate to, if you are doing Control F, it's hard to find a Control F on the right-hand side. That's something that I struggle with. So if people are relying on Control F to get to the information they want, they're straight up not going to find it. And the Control F issue is going to be compounded by the fact that when you organize text to be user-friendly, you rely on something called entry points, which is visual affordances to help the user stay concentrated on what they're doing and notice things. I've screenshotted part of the New York City info box, the New York City Wikipedia page info box over here. And just try to see if you can see its population rank in the United States at a glance. Maybe you saw it immediately. Maybe it took you a little bit longer to see. Next, see if you can find its urban density. Next, see if you can find its water area. Next, see if you can find its government body type. Next, see if you can find its time zone not in the summer. Next, see if you can find its area codes. Next, see if you can find its population estimate in July 2021. I'm sure at least a couple of those stumped you because there's like barely any organization to this, and the headlines don't pop out at you, and stuff isn't in alphabetical order, and it's not really what you were looking for. You're not deeply emotionally invested in it. There's no Control F in this image. If there were Control F, it would appear on the right-hand side. It's not in the middle of an article where these words are appearing next to each other to reinforce the fact that this is in fact what you're looking for. In some of the cases, there is additional nearby information to help you realize that yes, this is what you're looking for. But for example, the time zone section is all alone. The demonym section is, well, like that they're called New Yorkers. That's completely by itself. There's nothing to the left or right of it, or I guess above or below it, to suggest to you, oh, you're on the right track to find demonym. Wait, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So it's just like kind of a mess and not easy to find things. Oops. Oh gosh. So you're going to be relying on Control F, and Control F again is just not working well on the right hand side. So you're kind of left with an information overload here, which makes you not want to use it and rely on Control F, and Control F is unfun. Anyway, I'll move on now. So, information behavior problems. For this book, I have a book linked here, and I highly recommend reading it. You can probably read only the first half. It's a pretty dense book. I think it was about 500 pages long, but the last 100 pages are all references. It's a literature review of the field. So it pretty much goes over a lot of popular, or like not, it's not like popular science, but I mean within this narrow academic field, popular reviews and papers and definitions and stuff. And the last 3 chapters are like really just summaries of papers. So getting through just the first like 6 or so chapters is going to give you a really solid foundation on what's important to know about information science. Information science and information behavior. And if you're trying to make good UI UX for people, knowing these principles and knowing what people have already learned is really important. So the 2 particular terms that I wanted to include here are information overload and serendipity. And infoboxes cause information overload. Like there's just way too many facts here. If you're only looking for one, you're going to get overwhelmed and go away. And they avoid serendipity. For example, if you're looking for urban density is not placed near facts similar to urban density. It doesn't tell you about urban density in different boroughs. It doesn't tell you about historical urban density over the years. It doesn't tell you about urban density of different ethnic groups. It doesn't tell you about the effects of urban density on kids' schooling. It doesn't tell you about the effects of urban density on the environment. It doesn't tell you about anything that might be interesting to you if you're interested in urban density, and it doesn't let you stumble upon or accidentally discover information instead of intentionally seeking for it. There's no related information close to each other. And so in the age of Wikipedia infoboxes, people have access to so much information and they're not learning it because it's not organized in a way that's happy for people to joyously learn new things. So I think it's a real tragedy that people are trained to go directly to the info box. So are info boxes bad then? Not exactly. What is Anakin saying? Don't let your info boxes get everywhere, by which I mean have too much stuff in them. Regularly prune old info boxes that either are completely unimportant or have unimportant things in them. Do you really need that photo, that cover photo that you put in them? Is department name always in the first sentence of your copy? Has office number been discontinued now that you're all remote? Maybe favorite ice cream could be moved to the main body text or a trivia section at the end of the page. Yes, it's cute, but it's not actually important. Great. You can delete all of these things then. Concise info boxes where every single field is legitimately important and does not belong elsewhere are fine. Make sure that you revisit them regularly. And that's the important part, that this isn't a once-in-a-time thing because you saw this talk, but that you continue to do it regularly. This has to be a behavior change. And continue pruning out-of-date info. And please, please, please don't put any secretly one-to-many fields there. Make a separate table lower down on the page. And once you've pruned your info box, how much lower on the page it has to be isn't that big of a difference because you've pruned your info box, and so you have much more horizontal space back. What Anakin is saying continued. I also love this screenshot from, I think that's from the League of Legends page on Wikipedia. The idea of splitting up your info box content per section so that you can get some serendipity back. For example, if this was in the top level info box, you would just see some scores. But if it's in the section about critical reception, you see the info box about scores, and then you can also continue reading about the reception in qualitative text. Because qualitative text is the only way that you can really gain serendipity, because you're reading words written by a human or maybe ChatGPT that are pertinent to the information seeker's question. When Anakin is saying fiend, an info box doesn't mean an everything box. Just because something is one-to-one with your entity doesn't mean it belongs there. A programming solution to this is set variables there and access them lower on the page. I know I just said variables, but a discussion of whether or not you can use variables is out of scope for this talk. If something is one-to-many, it definitely does not. Don't think about what you want to tell your readers. Think about what do you want your readers to know. And finally, always complicate your own life to make your users happy. So I'll take any questions if anyone has any.
There's one I'm copying now, and then I'm waiting for the stream to catch up for the audience in person.
Okay, I kind of lost the tab.
You kind of lost, what's that?
Hop in tab.
Oh yeah, do you want me to put the questions in Element?
Can you put the hop in tab in Element?
Yes.
I think I just closed it.
I'm just going to feed you the any questions in Element, and then you can read them and then respond to them.
Okay, wait, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
There seems to be a design philosophy that guides the intent of your presentation. It sounds like you accept they can be used sometimes and not thrown away entirely. Is there a good use case design principle for them in your opinion? Okay, that's a great question. So I think that info boxes should be used when there's literally no other possible way to convey that information to the user in a clean way. So, for example, if you're making a page about a person, then it's likely that somewhere on the page you're going to need to include their department info, position, skill set, stuff like not quite resume because they're not a candidate, they're an employee. And I don't see why that has to go in an info box. That can be like the chart, and everyone knows the location of the chart. However, something like maybe joined company on, like company join date, that might be a little bit more info box appropriate, because I guess, so let's look back at the informational behavior problems. So if there's a piece of information that is both important, and so it's unlikely to contribute to information overload because people need to be able to see it, and it's also not really related to anything else on the page, in that case, I would say it's a good candidate for an info box. Because if it has high serendipity with other things on the page, then you can make another chart for it, such as a lot of geographical information about a country. But there are some things that are important and have low serendipity with anything else on the page, such as a person's tenure with a company, and your HR department may have decided that showing tenure is very important to increase morale. And so I could see putting some, but again, that's going to have like 0 to serendipity. So I could see putting something like that. What about collapsed by default sections in the info box? In general, the most important thing with a collapsed by default section is to have it be very clearly labeled. So if it's very clearly labeled, and like the user, like, so for example, a see more collapse section is not a good idea. You should never do that. Or like a for advanced users, never a good idea, because no one knows what to expect from that. But like, see this information, see information about the 2021 to 2022 decks in a Magic the Gathering info box. I don't know if that is meaningful. I don't play MTG, but maybe that would make sense in an MTG wiki. You could show hide that. But in that case, we're getting so specific that I would say take it out of the info box and make a left-hand aligned table for it. Because again, remember, you just remember this page and ask if you really want to be taking up that much space. Because even once they expand it, they're still going to have to collapse past it. Okay, it looks like I ran out of time. So anyway, thanks for listening to this. This was a talk that I had been planning on giving since 2020. So I'm really excited that I finally got to do it now. And I hope that you will use fewer and smaller info boxes in the future.
That's great. Thanks, Megan. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm 100% totally convinced, but I got a good laugh out of it, and certainly learned something new. And I think I have a takeaway of pruning my info boxes like I should for normal wiki pages, and that might have been, the big point you're trying to make. So, thanks again, and enjoy a round of applause from Texas. And that concludes for today.